Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Shang Institute School of Tibetan Medicine webinar. My name is Menpa Matthew, and today I have with me a very special guest and friend, Mariano Gil, and we are going to be talking to you about meditation for health and happiness. If this is your first time joining our webinar, I'll just tell you a little bit about it. We do these on Friday mornings, about once a month or so these days. We've been doing it ever since the start of the pandemic, and we bring really amazing experts in health and wellness. We also bring a lot of special teachers from the Buddhist lineage, and we talk about how both spiritual knowledge and health and wellness knowledge of all different types intersect with the world of traditional Tibetan medicine and all of its related knowledge bases. If you're interested to learn more about Shang School of Tibetan Medicine and to join future courses or webinars like this, you can find us at tibetanmedicineschool.org, and you can join our online community at community.tibetanmedicineschool.org. And in fact, not only are we streaming this live on Facebook today, but we also have a live audience that came through our community here, and you can also join that live audience without being on Facebook if you go to community.tibetanmedicineschool.org. And after our chat today, we do a live Q&A through the online platform. So be sure to join us there for both today's webinar Q&A and future courses, which we have some amazing courses coming up with special teachers, like the course we did last month with Garchen Rinpoche, which was the immersion in the Medicine Buddha Mandala. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Mariano Gil. Mariano Gil has an amazing background. He is actually trained as a medical doctor and switched to a career in music, graduating from the prestigious Berklee College of Music in Boston, which my very own niece goes to, by the way. He is a New York-based musician and visual artist, and he has paintings, and he's been practicing Buddhist meditation since 1988. And he's an instructor of Santi Maha Sangha, which is an educational system of Buddhist Dharma teachings developed by the great Dzogchen master Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, who is the founder of the Shang Institute School of Tibetan Medicine. So this is going to be a fun conversation. Really happy to be here with Mariano today. Mariano, how are you doing out there?
Good, good.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. And hi, Matthew. Thanks for the introduction and for having me on.
Excellent. Well, how's the weather in New York today?
It's actually beautiful. I can see, this room is not so illuminated, but I can see outside from here and there's a lot of sunshine. So it's a beautiful day.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did it start to get humid out that way yet?
A little bit.
All right. Yeah, I remember the humidity was intense for me living out there in Massachusetts when I trained with the Shang Institute. That was always an interesting dynamic when it got to July, August. It was, whoa, so intense sometimes.
And you're in what? You're in Oakland?
So now I live in Benicia, California. You know, I'm from Berkeley, born and raised in Berkeley. I traveled, I took a big leap of faith and moved out to Segilgar to study traditional Tibetan medicine at the Shang Institute in Conway, which is also, as you know, the home base of the Dzogchen community in America, in Segilgar East. And I lived out there for 7 years, actually, after studying the full scope of medicine for 4 years. You know, I stayed for a few more years, and then as things go, you know, I went out to a retreat in at Zamlingar, well, many retreats actually, and I ended up meeting my wife, who's a Russian practitioner from the community, and we ended up kind of bouncing back and forth between Zamlingar in the Canary Islands and Russia for a while, and moved back to the Bay Area, and then sort of ended up nesting here in Benicia, which is a little hidden gem of the Bay Area. And I invite you to come visit me sometime if you ever get a
Nice.
chance. Yeah, it's really nice out here. So I'm really interested in exploring your background a bit more. It's so unique, and I know that you have a lot of insight from your own experience around, you know, this intensive training, medical training, and then, you know, you kind of did a major pivot, and in that, you know, time, you also had this emerging you know, experience around meditation, which is quite a long history. Gosh, you are an old school meditator. That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about your background in those sort of three areas and how they intersect. You've got medical training, switch to music career, and somewhere in the middle, you have this amazing immersion in meditation.
Well, in a way, I don't see them so separate in my own personal life. Of course, in terms of profession and practicalities, they're very different. But when I went to medicine, I had many interests, and I already was playing music. I was already going to conservatory since high school, more or less. And I always had a fascination with biology and understanding how nature works, but also the mind and the human body. So at one point I decided, okay, I guess medicine is the one that integrates the most. And my main interest was the area of the psyche, the mind. So I was thinking of being some kind of a therapist or shrink, or, you know, it was, at least back then, it was traditional in Buenos Aires, where I come from, in Argentina. Even if you were going in the psychoanalytic route, it was not uncommon, actually very common at that time, to go through the medical route, do your residence psychiatry, and meanwhile get training in psychoanalysis, and then switch fully to psychoanalysis and having that, you know, that medical background. I think nowadays people go straight into psychology, and then that's the route they follow for the most part. So that was, while I was doing that, I was painting, I was doing music, but it was clearly my path was to serve in some form of health career, you know, with medicine. And yeah, at one point, you know, certain things added up, and I had a big crisis like I never had, maybe a year and a half before graduation. And at that point, it was clear that I wanted to take a break before going in that train of like residency, specialization. So it was 6 years of medical training, and already was doing some, you know, training in psychoanalysis and my own personal readings, but haven't yet been in, you know, my interest in Buddhism hadn't really started. I was very scientifically minded, and or artistic too, but not so much, you know, so-called spiritual hadn't hit me yet. And then after that big crisis, which I guess was started by an accident, a car accident, coming back from playing actually music. I had a bad accident with a car turnover. You know, we could have all died, but we didn't. But I guess I had, I don't know if you would call it post-traumatic, but I went into long period where I was dealing with a lot of panic and fear, and the studying of medicine, I tended to go introspective with it. You know, a lot of people would have an easy time separating themselves from patient and disease, and it wasn't my case. I tended to internalize everything and see it more from the inside. And around that time, right after graduation, Berklee College of Music did a seminary, you know, like a workshop, 10-day in Argentina. I attended just because I love the music, I love jazz, and I knew about the school, and I got a scholarship. So at that point, I decided, okay, my break before going into residency is going to be going to Berklee for a semester. And as a master, turned into 2, 3, 4, etc. And I graduated from Berklee. And so it wasn't a clear plan to switch careers right away. It was a gradual process of taking a break and realizing, and at that point, being in Boston, some of my roommates were involved in Buddhist meditation, particularly one of them. And we lived very close to a insight meditation center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so I started going and having some readings, and that really spoke to me. So I very soon after started going to first a 3-day retreat, and then I did 2 silent 10-day retreats. Like I finished one and I signed up for the next like 5 days later, and I was in another.
Wow.
So yeah, so I became very, very devoted to that meditation practice, and I had a very insightful experience with that practice, something that was very new to me in terms of particularly all these things that were going through my mind, and the sort of the panicky, out of control thing that I had in that after the accident. My mind would just start racing. I suppose we all get that at some point, right? Our minds go very fast, but this was extreme for me, and I couldn't sleep, and I had to do the exams, medical career, a lot of studying, and so it affected my body. I was very tense and having a really hard time, and being in retreat for the first time, I discovered that this methods allow me to find a certain peace and a calm and a way of investigating what was going on that I didn't have the means before. It was something completely new to me. Not that I did have that introspective tendency and insight, but something was lacking that didn't allow me to go further into that.
Interesting. So it sounds like all 3 of your sort of major influences in your life were very integrated in some way. They all sort of it all happened at a kind of a crossroads. And I'm interested also. I mean, obviously today we're talking about meditation for health and happiness. So you have had really direct experience working with meditation from the ground up in that manner for your own health and happiness, clearly. So, what was going on there? How did that work? What was the mechanics of at least from your perspective and experience, why did it work so well for you to use meditation as a anchor to come out of that difficult time for your mental, physical health? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I like to mention is that, traditionally in Buddhism, there's a lot of reflections that make your mind turn into the teachings, make you realize some of the futility of the things that we pursue and how they don't really provide for much happiness. I think it's not my unique experience. I think a lot of people that turn towards some kind of spiritual practice, and Buddhism in particular, have been sort of hit by life in some kind of way. So I don't think I'm alone there. But for me, the interest and motivation wasn't just sort of intellectual. I was really dealing with something that brought me a lot of anguish at the time, and that so it was a combination. And in a way, my interest in the arts and medicine had a similar connotation. Like I tended to look inside and try to understand things, and that very curiosity, I would feel like I would like to apply it to other people and helping other people. So that was medicine. With meditation, what happened is that right away, I noticed how disconnected I was with some aspects of my being, particularly, I was very much into sports growing up, but and I did a lot of yoga at some point during my medical career. But meditation brought something new in terms of sort of turning the focus inwards and the introspection aspect. And the tool, you know, what is called shamatha in the language of Buddhism, or Shine in Tibetan, which is the calming down of the mind, which is bringing your mind a little bit more in contact with your body, slowing down. That part is what opened up things that I didn't really know were possible. I remember reading things about, reading Krishnamurti, and he would talk about like, observe your thoughts, and I just couldn't make any sense of that, or, observing your emotions. It's like, I'm overcome by my emotions. My thoughts, I think, like I can't observe my thoughts. Maybe I'm thinking about my thoughts. I couldn't make sense. When I started going, particularly in retreat and having a regular practice, just working with your breath, that alone, just being focused with the breath, brought a certain grounding and calm that I hadn't experienced. So the mind slowed by itself. When people say, calm down, if you try, you realize it's really not very possible. It's not very easy to calm down. But here I had initially what was a technique that when I applied it very consistently and very dedicated, I was at the time, I realized that it really had an effect. It slowed my mind down. And then through that slowing down, I was able to see a lot of processes that before would take over my being. Like this anguish, for example, at one point I remember in retreat, I started getting sort of the beginning of this panicky thing, and I was in silence, surrounded by silent people during their meditation. So it was completely on my own, but I realized that the technique allowed me to remain there and be accepting, and slowly that shifted in a way that never happened. What used to happen is the thoughts would come and sort of take over. So thoughts brought more thoughts, and almost like a paranoid sense of self-consciousness. Oh, the panic, and the panic brings more panic, and so forth. And here, that grounding in the breath and in the body sensations allow me to see that just as a process, and it sort of came and went, and I was left in a very, very pleasant, almost blissful experience. I'm not saying that's what always has to happen, but that was my first big, like, oh, wow, this is completely new. Like,
wow, that's really beautiful. As you're talking, it's just reminding me a lot of what I talk about in my work. I call myself a vitality coach now. So I work with people to, help lose weight, through sustainable ways, not like dieting, so to say. I work with people to have, personalized diet and lifestyle sort of preventative, plans. And also I'm getting into fitness, but personal training even. But I take all of those with the approach that there's this intrinsic link between our body and our mind, and we can't, approach one without the other. It's impossible. In fact, my experience losing weight, for example, is that my mind was the first thing to just become super clear and just really much more vital. I just felt so much more alive as a result of the physical changes. But I hear, in a way, something kind of like a reverse of that in your experience, which was that you used about the same, that you used your body to kind of anchor your mind. And, it really reminds me of a field that I think we have similar background and knowledge base in, which is this idea of the three gates of body, energy, and mind that we talk about in, I know in Buddhism quite substantially, Buddhist meditation, but also in Tibetan medicine and in Tibetan yoga, which I also teach. I teach yantra yoga and Respira breathe method. And I really focus a lot of my work on this knowledge base these days. I oftentimes am talking a lot, especially about the energy level, because this is sort of that hidden link bridge between our body and our mind. And as you are sort of pointing at, our energy is really governed by our breathing. In fact, if we get into the deeper anatomy of Tibetan medicine, when you really look at the moment of conception, we have these three components from the beginning, which is a little bit different, I think, than Western medicine. It's one of the areas where we differ. And you can tell me about this because you've traded it. This is perfect. So, at the moment of conception in Tibetan medicine, we talk about sort of four main needs. You can break it down that way. But basically, there's the mother and father's, reproductive fluid. Also, we could draw a link with that with the vital essence, which gets into a deeper understanding. And then we have the consciousness. So this is very unique, right? This consciousness, which is floating around in a topic we won't get into today, the bardo, at the time of waiting to be reborn. So there's these three components: mother's, ovum, father's sperm, consciousness floating around. But the important link is the karma, right? There has to be karma in order for there to be conception. All three karmas need to be matching, right? So this gets into the Buddhist world quite substantially. But where it comes into what we're talking about today is this idea of the energy, which is that in order for, we know that for there to be a conception, there has to be some action, some energy, right? To have this this conception between the mother and father, but also the consciousness at the time of conception it's said that it's sort of arriving to that point by way of the Dzogchen Lung, the life-sustaining wind, this energy, right? And this energy, it's considered, carries the traces of our karmic, our karmic energy, basically. So essentially, our karmic energy by way of this, our karmic sort of traces by way of this energy, this Dzogchen Lung, carries our consciousness to the moment of conception. And then from that point on, this energy is the base of our breathing. And then all of the movements in our body, our circulation, moving around like this, moving our limbs, expelling impurities, it becomes this energy that is part of our physiology throughout our life. And we're always dealing with it with every breath. And so it's always been this kind of bridge from the moment of conception between our mind and our body. So I'm really passionate. I've taken a lot of, I talk about this a lot. I do workshops on it. So it's something I'm really interested in exploring. I'd love to hear your experience with that, what your insight is in terms of these three gates and how they relate. I sometimes say, we talk a lot about mindfulness these days, right? But it seems to me that oftentimes what mindfulness is really pointing at is more bodyfulness. Like we need to get back in our bodies because we're so much in our minds. And I think that sometimes people are jumping into meditation thinking they're going to do something up here, and not down here. But of course, a lot of meditation practices start with this anchoring in the body. So what are your thoughts about all that? I'm interested to hear.
Well, my first reaction is we didn't get that in medical school. The conception is very different, and it's wonderful what science has achieved and medical science in the West, but that's where I started to. Maybe this is too much of a Spanish expression. Me hace ruido, like it's noisy. Like I started having a little bit of trouble with a certain reductionistic approach, that doesn't considers that everything is built out of matter, almost like we build a computer, and mind seems to be a byproduct of of those material elements coming to certain complexities. And, it's fascinating, but I felt like something was lacking, particularly in a concrete manner, not just in a theoretical point of view. I would see, not all, I met some really incredible doctors. Some of them were my teachers, and some became very good friends who I admire very deeply, both in terms of their understanding and how they treat their patients and in their dialogue and considering them as a whole, right? But a lot of times I would be very disappointed as a student, the way, they would refer as a patient that we would all have to go, all these students would have to go touch and learn, and they were referred, oh, well, let's go and see that cirrhotic liver on bed number, blah, blah. So it's like a number and it really, I was having trouble with that. And after, so part of my crisis was like, do I really want to be a doc? Can I do this way? And with Buddhism, yes, as I mentioned, I discovered this connection, this bridge between, initially I felt sort of the bridge was the breath. The breath, simply by bringing awareness, would bring a certain calmness to the body, and awareness of the body, because the breath also, you feel it in the body initially, would bring a certain peace in the mind. And then the other way around too. As soon as I would enter into more meditational space, meaning the mind seems to be, I'm saying mind, it has no real location, would bring some peacefulness to the body. So that was one clear insight I had initially. I have to say that as I progress in the practice, and this is before I met Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, who embodies a different kind of teaching with which I connected very, very deeply. During my meditation practice, I found myself being able to observe my mind, which I couldn't before. And observe my mind means somehow being able to observe the activity of my thoughts without being caught up in them, without being completely trapped in the narrative. And that, I think it was a personal affinity that became my sort of obsession. I know obsession doesn't sound very meditative, but that was my main interest. I realized that the body aspect gave me my initial entry point, sort of, if we talk as gates, that was my entry gate. That was the door that opened first, because the other one was a little bit out of control. Mm-hmm. And the energy aspect, which as a medical student and scientific, I would consider it very new agey, for many, like, it seemed very like, just, light. And, like it all felt a little superstitious or something, like a wishful thinking. But then when doing meditation, it started to become something more experiential, more concrete, maybe something that is difficult to put into words, but I started to sense that in different ways, both in terms of mind, that sense of almost like a river, something that is flowing, that it can be a bunch of thoughts that distract you, but that even can become something a little more, I don't know, I'm thinking the word luminous, but it's not that I'm seeing lights necessarily. It's like one could start doing that investigation in terms of mind and bring another level of stability and depth to the practice. So for me, they're all very much interconnected. And at some point, the thing with mindfulness and the mindfulness movement is that sometimes it seems to stay just at certain levels. And the richness of the ancient traditions like Buddhism is that they go very far. So the benefits also go further.
I love that you mentioned that about energy being sort of this seems sort of esoteric idea. because again, I also really, because of my background in Tibetan medicine, this is one of the beautiful things about Tibetan medicine, is that it is a science, you know, by itself. It's an ancient science. It's a little different than modern science. It has a different view of the universe, you know, based off the 5 elements, basically. Like, that's the fundamental principle, is that the whole universe is composed of the 5 elements. And, you know, everything we do is kind of in relationship to our inner 5 elements and the outer 5 elements. And then when they conflict, we have disease, right? Or when we have too much of one element or another, or one element hurts the other, we have a problem, right? And then what do? We use diet, we use lifestyle, we use you know, herbal medicine and external therapies, which are all composed of the 5 elements, to, you know, reharmonize the elements, the internal elements. And then again, we're left with our daily life, interacting with the elements and trying to stay in harmony. I say all that because also, you know, our teacher, again, Menpa Wangmola, also would always say that, you know, you can also see Tibetan medicine as purely spiritual because of this amazing integration with Buddhist knowledge. You know, you can also look at it from that point of view, but also this is because of the principles of the 5 elements, really fundamentally, because as you know, you know, in Tibetan Buddhism, it's very much connected with the 5 elements, you know, sort of view of the universe, right?
Yeah.
Same idea, or same thing, basically.
5 emotions.
Yeah. And so, but the better way is to see the merge of the two, that Tibetan medicine is really a integration of both science and spirituality. And this is a more whole view of the tradition, but also, you know, everything, right? And I think that honestly, the world is becoming a little more open, I feel. And mindfulness is a sign of that, I think. You know, yes, it's not, you know, it's mostly a secular tradition now, and you know, it's you know, but there's this openness to the world being a little more than what we just are told. I think, and not necessarily in a religious sense. You know, it's more of just knowing that there's this connection that we all have, I guess, that is deeper. But I say all that because I oftentimes, you know, try to address the fact that this idea of energy doesn't have to be something so esoteric. In fact, what I said before, it's literally our breath. You know, the simplest way to understand energy is that you breathe. And with every inhalation and exhalation, the nature of movement, the way we can understand it, because energy is just movement, right? It's just movement and of course, in the 5 elements theory, we talk about the wind element. This is the nature of movement and energy in the sort of, in our karmic vision, right? It's the way we experience it is the wind element. But of course, if you want to get more subtle, it's like color and vibration and, you know, sound and all of these things, right? That are more, get into the more Buddhist ideas. But in simple terms, we can experience energy through our breath. And this is the base of all the movements in our bodies, and it relates to all the movements externally. In fact, stress, the experience of stress, is generally around movements, right? Outside of us. We have movements in the atmosphere, we have emails that come, we have things flying around us, this external stimuli. And the way we respond to those movements is either we have an acute stress response, you know, and we see it as something, a threat, or we work with it and we harmonize. And a lot of this response, again, is governed by our breathing. If we breathe well, we get less of a alarming response to things. You know, we activate. If we breathe deeply and diaphragmatically, you know, we activate our parasympathetic nervous system and we stay calm and relaxed. If we breathe shallow and you know, fast, we tend to freeze up or want to run and start to mobilize our energy to get the hell out of there. So yeah, it just made me think of that when you said that, because I think it's time for us to open up a little bit and realize that science and spirituality don't need to be mutually exclusive.
No, I completely agree. I mean, that's sometimes I have too many interests and you know, but that's one, this, like I felt at that time that there's, and I still feel, and I'm not the only one, there's many authors that I've discovered that are exploring that area that science somehow seems to be missing. For example, when you talk about the 5 elements, if you mention this to most medical doctors in Western science, and you talk about earth and air element or wind element, and you talk about space and fire, it almost seems like, oh, well, that's some kind of primitive form of understanding. Now we talk about H2O, you know, 2 molecules of hydrogen, and that's water with 1 of oxygen. And we have a much better description because there is no understanding of what it implies, that somehow what was left out in that more material description that Western science has is the whole aspect of conscience or mind. And I've seen some very good explanations of that's what the 5 elements don't exclude, that they include it. So that's why it's a very different way of approaching thing, and that's why it's more holistic. And mindfulness, by the way, I'm not by any, it's a very, very, very used word, so it can mean so many things, just like the word meditation. But mindfulness is wonderful, and it's at the basis of all practices. There is no practice, it doesn't matter what kind of Buddhist practice you're talking about, without mindfulness, you know, or presence. You know, there's the main problem we encounter or obstacle is our distraction. And so mindfulness is just coming back to our presence, whether we use a concrete object or not. As we progress in our practice, we can realize that some of those elements are there from the start, and that it's not all about sort of like a control, you know, someone who's checking if you're present all the time. There's a point that you realize that there's a natural presence, and that not everything has to be lived in such a conceptual way, which again doesn't discard the importance of intelligence or using thoughts, but you're not a prisoner of them. And likewise in terms of emotions, for example, that's a very clear way, you know, where we see emotions. And I think even those who deny energy in this spiritual way, you know, when they talk about, oh, he was like burning with anger, you know, so that already shows that we intuitively know that there's like a fire of anger. So energetic expression, and is something that we see the manifestations when we see a person that is enraged, but also we all know ourselves being angry, and we know that we feel that fire of anger. So it all makes sense. But sometimes we don't have any tools, or we don't know how to understand it or how to approach it. And that's,
I totally resonate with what you're saying, and think that that's why I like the theory of the 5 elements, is because if you can call it primitive or whatever you want to, but I'm saying I know you're not saying that. I know maybe some sort of, you know, intellectual scientists or experts or physicists or somebody might say something like that. But, you know, I actually appreciate the simplicity of the 5 elements theory. And it's a foundation that you can really come back to more easily and understand your own experiences better. It's very practical, let's say. Whereas I love modern science too. I try as much as possible to keep myself up to date with all the emerging sciences, in particular like microbiome, circadian rhythm, like all these incredible things where, in fact, we're seeing the ancient science and modern science start to see eye to eye more and more in my own perspective. And also, you know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is very much, you know, supportive of modern science, and he really encourages people to investigate through the scientific perspective and methodologies, even the effects of meditation, right, on our brain and on our health. So I just appreciate that, that I can come back to the 5 elements theory for that in that way. So with all that said, in terms of the modern science of the effect of meditation, I know there's been a lot of sort of research on that. Some of it by the influence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and otherwise. What are some of the things that you might recommend to somebody to use meditation as a means for bringing health back? What are some areas, or what are some things they could watch out for? Like, what are some red flags? Like, hey, you might need some meditation in your life, or and what are some results? Besides, you had your own experience, but what might people expect to happen by practicing meditation for their health and for their mental well-being?
Well, on the one hand, I can see the innumerable benefits that meditation can have. It does take some dedication, so one has to have a certain affinity, and sometimes it's one is not necessarily born with that affinity. Some people are, but sometimes it's life that brings you in contact, or you notice that certain things are not working. You're trying this to find some peace, but it's not very lasting, or you went to different types of treatment, but this particular issue doesn't work. So that was my experience. Of course, my consideration of Buddhist meditation goes beyond the therapeutical benefits. So I almost see them as secondary benefits, but very important. But a lot of times, if you talk just very simply without going straight into Buddhist philosophy or the philosophy behind all of this, and there can be a tendency to run away from things that hurt, whether it's emotional or physical. And with this idea that we can sort of like sweep it under the carpet and, it won't be noticeable. And this is not news. We all know that. For example, we accumulate tensions, we don't deal with certain situations, and then it comes out as some form of illness or stress that has been gathering for a lot of time. And then one day our back or lower back goes boom, and we can't even walk, or we have some problem in our, we get acid, in our stomach, or we get all kinds of tensions or headaches or fears, and I think we all intuitively, sorry about that.
It's a doctor. The doctor's calling.
It's actually my family in Argentina calling. So I think meditation and mindfulness can be a great way of turning that around and daring to look at things more eye to eye and see how even just that starts changing things. Like there's and it's very much a beginner's experience, a beginner or advanced too, experience of a meditator, that you'll notice how maybe before you didn't notice, and now you notice how you tend to push away certain things that you don't like. So that can be a very meditational experience. What distracts you is because you don't want to stay with what's there. But once you start having that experience, you notice that a lot of things can change by themselves, just by the sheer act of being aware of that mindfulness, bringing some presence. For example, a lot of the physical sensations that I was having, I think were because my mind was going at full speed, but was completely disconnected in that from my body. But I would get the signals. So my mind would make theories about what was happening. So I would get like slight hypochondria, let's say, as a medical student, and I would feel like, oh, I'm feeling, oh, maybe it's my heart, and you know, like a feedback vicious cycle, you know. Whereas when you bring attention that is not conceptual, that is not your mind trying to analyze and judge, something shifts all by its own. So whether it's psychological problems, whether it's tensions, whether it's things in the body, whether it's some illness that even one is treating it with a proper doctor, I think having meditation can really help to accompany that process. Also dealing with the fear of, you know, like fear doesn't necessarily help the recovery. So sometimes by doing meditation, one can explore that fear itself. And by that light of awareness, a lot of problems just dissolve on their own. So
nice.
There's many areas where that could work, you know, and those three aspects that you mentioned, body, energetic, and mind, are obviously all three comprised.
Very nice. Yeah. So, you know, as we're kind of coming to the end of our hour here together, I'm, you know, interested in maybe we can talk a little bit about some basic ways that somebody who's maybe new to this whole idea of meditation, some of the things, you know, what are some entry points for people? You know, coming back to my original statement, I think people need more bodyfulness. I always tell people, hey, you know, if you're not taking care of your body first, you know, this is the first mindfulness, is, you know, governing our physical dimension, because this is, we have a bit more control over. Like you said, you know, your mind is just kind of flowing, and sometimes it just takes off, and actually we can literally use the body not only in a meditative manner to anchor, but really, you know, from my experience, you know, if we change our diet and lifestyle to be more healthy, we're already affecting our mind because of the energy, because of its relationship to our neurological system and how it's governed by this energy. You know, it's riding on the energy level all the time. So when we heal our body, you know, we really can have some more daily presence in our life. Really, just throughout the day, we can have better presence because our mind is more kind of grounded in its home. And also, I always tell folks, like, hey, the first mindfulness is just, you know, throughout the day, keep your spine straight. You know, I know we're talking about meditation, but you know, meditation, mindfulness, they're always talked about kind of together. And I'm always kind of suggesting to people that, you know, meditation is fantastic, but, you know, really you can bring presence into anything you do in the day. And especially when you're sitting, you know, when you keep your spine straight, you naturally will breathe better because, you know, your breathing musculature is all set up in the proper form to have very nice diaphragmatic breathing, but also your nervous system is kind of more aligned, let's say, and you tend to have more clarity. So with all that said, you know, those are some entry points I always give people, like, to this sort of idea of presence and awareness, which meditation is there to give a field in. But those are sort of the body and energy level, right? Those are kind of dealing firstly with those, and meditation is working more directly with the mind level in relationship to those two. So I'm curious, just for the simple purpose of health and happiness, because that's what we're talking about today, what are some basic sort of entry points for people? What can people do to utilize meditation and for those simple kind of results? You know, I know that you are have a very much deeper relationship to meditation. You know, maybe we could say for this idea of ultimate happiness, right? There's the sort of mundane happiness and ultimate happiness. But yeah, what are some ways that people can sort of enter in a simple way? And also, what should people watch out for? Because we mentioned some of the pitfalls of mindfulness in this trend. You know, are there pitfalls or things to watch out for?
Well, the thing with the mindfulness movement, which is not the same as mindfulness per se, is that sometimes there can be appropriations, and they only take one part, and so sometimes you're losing some of the other benefits and some of the things that can go deeper. But that's a very personal choice. Not everyone is ready. So one of my recommendations in general is to find a good guide, a good teacher, a good instructor, because it's not so easy to do it by oneself, because here what we're dealing with mostly is habits and conditionings. So it's very easy to, and a lot of what meditation does is deal with this thing called ego. And it's very easy that the ego takes control of the meditation, and maybe there's not much benefit. So then when you have a teacher that is experienced, they can help you go further, and understand if you're falling too much in this direction or too much in that direction. So finding good teachers and checking who these teachers are, that can be a very important. We're very fortunate in this time period that there's a lot of great literature. There's been very great translators. So if you're interested in the sources, you can get a lot of great information. As an entry point, as you said, having presence, for example, just having presence of your breath, there's a difference between, I do think that it's very important to take care of your health. And sometimes meditators can be a little bit, just hardcore. Meditation is going to take care of everything, and then they don't go to the dentist. No, go to the dentist. Like if you like meditation. If you need to get surgery, go get your surgery. Or if your knee is hurting because you have a problem in your knee, you don't need to stay in pain. But meditation teaches you to accept what and how you are in the moment as an initial entry point. So it's also good to embrace that aspect, that is not always trying to change and be a better me. Have this entry point of presence, which is seeing things exactly as they are, including my own condition, because a lot of changes happen from that presence. It's almost like a self-regulating principle. And so bringing awareness to the breath throughout the day, without trying to control it, before even getting into the pranayamas or more like exercises, which are wonderful, of course, too. Just having some presence, or presence as you walk, as you said, or as you move throughout your day, or if you are someone that works in an office and is in front of a computer, or etc. Sometimes you can get too much in your head or filled with tensions. Just taking a few instants of just dropping everything. No one has to know what you're doing, and simply connecting with your physical sensations and your breath can really be helpful. If you want to take that a little further, of course, a daily practice is very much recommended. Even if it's a very short period, you get much more benefit from short periods of practice, but on a regular basis, than doing a marathon one day trying to understand everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of finding information and instruction, I'm very biased to the Buddhist, and at this point, I'm very connected with Tibetan Buddhism, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to go into sort of like the traditional or the spiritual, but sometimes that's where the best things are, but that's my take.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important to understand that sometimes we have a tendency to want to do it all on our own, and sometimes it's not so easy. So if you find yourself trying and you're failing, there's nothing. I think it's very helpful to find a group, a meditation group, some instructor, and at least get your first steps that way. Not to mention a retreat, because it's difficult to have those initial breakthroughs that you can have in meditation in the midst of your daily life. Once you have a little bit of experience and familiarity with the principles, it's a lot easier to apply it in your daily life. And if you cannot, by all means, do what you can. But it is, at least for me and in the experience of the people I've talked, taking those times, whether it's in your personal life, setting a little bit of time aside where you don't have distraction, where you don't have to answer the phone, where your kids or your family don't need to distract you, even if it's for 5-10 minutes, can be incredibly helpful. And once you nourish that, you can start extending the periods of time. And the depth of your discoveries, then you can really rely on that, because it's you don't need your teacher or your guides to be always with you. It's mostly to understand the principles and understand how to work it. Once you incorporate that, it's there.
Wow, I love your advice. So practical and straightforward. Perfect.
If you're really interested, of course, there's a lot of, the more you go deeper, the insights become more reliable. You don't depend on these more little corrective measures. It becomes not only a philosophy, in Buddhism, traditionally, they talk, first you study, then you reflect, and then you practice in that order. Because if you only study, you could just keep it in your mind. If you don't reflect, it might just be some thoughts that sounded great, but maybe you didn't understand it, and you're not quite convinced of the validity of this, or if it's for you. But then if you don't practice, there's not a whole lot of value in terms of this particular kind of disciplines. You want to embody this knowledge. And vice versa. There's people that, I just want to meditate. I don't want to study anything. Well, I advise a combination, because there's so many insights that without understanding that, yes, that's when you ask what are the, I don't know if dangerous, but it's easy to, to concoct one's own little recipe, and maybe it doesn't go very far. And, there's, at least from the historical Buddha, there's like 2,600 years of experience of meditators, having passed on this knowledge and having applied it. So it's a great resource, very, very rich. And combining those two things, not going too much with just the knowledge in your mind, not only going with the practice without understanding, combining both. I think that's where it starts becoming, it really gives, in that way.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for providing all that insight for everybody today. This has been an awesome conversation. I really have enjoyed it. And I'm wondering if there's any way that people can stay in touch with you or find out about any, meditation courses you are doing down the road. I know you're focused a lot on music these days, but how can people stay in touch or learn more about your work?
In terms of, the program I do with the Dzogchen community, I guess people, I don't know if you're going to post some information related to that, they can always get in touch. And if I'm doing some programs, there'll be information. I'm not doing right now any private courses, but if, I could put my email, or you could share my email. If someone has a question, is interesting, can definitely reach out. Of course, there's a lot of information out there, and if they're interested in Buddhism, I'm partial to my community and my teacher, but there's, I think it's very important that you find an affinity to what you're going to practice, because it takes a little patience, just like anything else, like music, mostly it's going to be you practicing your instrument. I'm doing like this because I play flute. And so it's important to have an affinity with the teacher, an affinity with the kind of teachings, because ultimately one needs to put some dedication of one's own. No one can touch you with a magical wand and provide that for you. So yes, I'll be happy to provide email if anyone has questions. I'm sure I'm going to be doing some programs. I mean, from now, this part of the year, I'm pretty focused on projects I have, but I will also have some programs connected to the Dzogchen community.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mariano. And this has just been a great conversation. I hope we get to do it again. And I hope we get to actually host you in our online community for some maybe meditation practices and
Sure.
study.
Yes,
that'd be awesome.
Of course. I'd love to give, instructions, like even very simple instructions. Yeah,
Awesome.
Maybe we'll get to do that sometime.
I hope so. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in today to the Shang School of Tibetan Medicine webinar. We've been here with Mariano Gil. You can reach out to us to find out his email address if you'd like to get in touch. You can also jump into our online platform at community.tibetanmedicineschool.org. That's community.tibetanmedicineschool.org, where in fact, we're about to do a little Q&A session for the listeners who have tuned in through our online community. We also have a whole host of different courses that we offer through the online community. Coming up, we have some really interesting stuff. I'll give a little sneak peek. We've got harmonizing the fire element, working with anger and health, coming up with Dzikar Kongtrul Rinpoche and our dear Menpa Punsok Wangmola and Menpa Adam that are going to guide that course. I believe it's September 10th, maybe September 11th. So check that out. That's going to be, it's not live yet on the platform, but it will be soon. So stay tuned. And yeah, we just hope to see you again at one of our next upcoming webinars. And thank you so much, everybody. We are going to end our Facebook live stream and start our Q&A here in our online platform. Thank you all. We look
Dzikar
forward to seeing you
Kongtrul
next time.
is one of the great teachers that are with us. So I'm glad to know that you're going to host him, and he has some great book talking about emotions and how to work with emotions and meditation.
There we go. We're there. We have a direct step on this path
sure.
coming right up. So we hope maybe Mariano will come. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. I'll check the information, and of course, yeah.
All right. Awesome. All right, everybody. We'll see you all soon.